Hello and welcome. I'm super excited to have you here this evening. We are going to be discussing a really awesome topic of what does the word advocate mean? But before we get to that, I just want to take a couple minutes to acknowledge that today is National Suicide Prevention Day, in addition to National Suicide Prevention Month this month. And I just want to make sure that anyone listening, if you need someone to talk to, please know that you can always reach out, whether it be to myself or calling 988 for help. But please feel free. My inbox is always just an email away, and feel free to reach out if you ever need anything. I am Kristen Lynn Norai, and I am the founder of and the beginning business of Inclusion Advocates and Allies. And this was something that really was born out of a dream that I had of becoming an advocate for children who had special education needs, because I worked in the public schools for over 23 years. And while I was in the public schools, I worked with some advocates. Some were very good and some were not so good. But the thing that I learned the most importantly was that children whose parents and families could afford to have an advocate present in those meetings with them often, if not always, got what they needed for their IEP or 504 plan. And it frustrated me a lot as a special education teacher, because I saw kids that didn't have a voice or whose parents were uninvolved often went without or got pushed to the back burner so that we could meet compliance needs or deadlines on cases that were considered hot. And I'm not criticizing any school system or any school district, because I know from all of the different times that all the years I've worked in the schools, that we are doing the best we can on the ground, and we're not funded and we're not given what we need to be able to truly meet the kids' needs. So I commend all of the educators out there that are continuing to push through and work with our children day after day to give them what they need, and putting more and more hats on every year as teachers are asked to do more and more in the classroom. But anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox and want to go ahead and get my guest up here as quick as I can, so that you can hear more from her than me, because that's the one that's going to be interesting to hear from. Lynn Jones is my sister from another mister, and I am going to bring her up now. I met Christine just about a year ago, almost a year ago. I wish we knew our anniversary date so we could celebrate.
Yes, that is true. We'll just make one up.
Yes. But in that year, we've spent 100, if not 150 hours together working on some very special projects. And I'm going to let you talk about that in particular. And then we'll jump in also to what does that word advocate mean? So go ahead first and just tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do.
Hi, my name is Christine Jones, and I have been teaching now for 31 years, going into my 31st year of teaching. So I taught in the younger grades. I've also taught in the special education program. And with the special education program, it was in the special needs abilities preschool program. So I was getting the very young students that were entering in 3, 4s, and 5s, and then I was transitioning them to kindergarten. And then I've also taught kindergarten, and then I'm on the teacher leadership team, and I also hold coaching positions within our school district as well. So some of them have been in my building, some have been out. I've done where people have been in my classroom, and we've done collaboration coaching experiences. And so I'm just really enjoying it, and I'm taking it again to the next step. So as far as being an administrator, at first I was like, yes, I want to be an administrator. And then I was like, I don't know about that. So I did not end up getting my administrative license. That's something that I still might end up getting, not to be a principal, but to have that background knowledge to, or my PhD. Those are a couple of things that I'm still wondering about in the back of my brain, just wondering if I shouldn't do that. Um, just so I could further my education. And so we were taking a look too at how we can go to the next step. So we started to talk, and we did a live show. It was in February, and afterwards we said, what do we need to do to bridge some gaps in education? What is lacking? So we started to talk about the parents and teachers working together. And then we started to just really quickly pull up some things. First thing we both thought about was a Venn diagram. We're like, oh,
Right.
there's got to be a Venn diagram on this. No. And then we started to pull up more things. So there's a lot on how to bridge the gap on the teacher side. There's not that many resources for the parent side of it. So that's a part we are looking at, is bridging the education gap between home and school. So
Absolutely.
we're going to be doing a parent class. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want me to talk about the parenting class?
Sure. I'm going to let you go ahead and tell us a little bit about it because I love the way you describe it with the way we've tiered it to match almost the process of the way you do interventions with children to help parents with that same level of tiered support.
So what we're trying to do is we're literally trying to bridge the gap between home and school. So we want to teach parents how a school is structured and how a school should meet their children's needs. So in my classroom, and in a classroom that really is child centered and moving the children up to the next step, it should have tier one instruction, which is the as a whole group instruction, which would be our book has tier one. And when we do our parenting classes, we're going to be taking that book and breaking it down. The second tier, it could be based on interest. I'd really like to know more about this, or, well, that doesn't really, I already kind of know about this, but I would have I have some other questions maybe in something else. So there could be a question answer session. And then the third part is gearing it to the individual family. So, what do they need? Looking at it from an educational lens, not from a doctor lens, but from a teacher lens. What would we do if that student was in the classroom? How would we approach this? And writing up a plan to help the family. So then that way, when they leave the class, they will have something tangible to take with them to try. Um, and then, given that, like when we talk about teachers tier one, I'll write down lesson plans, but sometimes you're looking at the class, you're like, those lesson plans might need to be tweaked. It doesn't fit that group. So that means that we will be looking at those plans and using those loosely, which will mean that we will need to collaborate during the parenting class to make sure that our goals are obtainable, or do they need to be changed? Does it need to be made harder or a little bit easier? Do we need to discuss things in a different way, just like an educator would do?
Absolutely. And I love the way that you eloquently laid that out. And I know that I'm a little biased because we created this together, but I'm so excited of what it might be able to bring to parents and helping parents feel, that power and support. Because I think a lot of times, I'll talk to friends who are very intelligent, smart people who just say, well, I just don't know what to do or what to ask. So I just don't. And so getting parents to realize that, they do need to speak up and jump in and have those conversations and advocate is extremely important. Which brings us kind of into our next part of the show, which is talking about what that word advocate means. And you have some very, very unique perspectives and experiences as an advocate, both as a classroom teacher, but also as a parent. So I wanted to ask you to just share a little bit with that about a little bit with us about that.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about my personal experience first. Um, so um, my my child was born in 1997. So in 1997, very little was known about autism. So I want to make sure that I preface that. So I was sitting in a meeting and they were talking about autism, and I was like, okay, so my child was 2 years old doing some of those things. I'm like, do you think that could be a possibility? Let's see. I didn't know that much about it. There was some, like things that I
Mhm.
should have known, like they could repeat all of Thomas the Tank Engine show 40 minutes
Right.
verbatim. That would have
Right.
been like the huge that
Word
I
for
felt like
word.
there, yes, word for word, right along with it. At 6 months, we were watching Frosty the what was that Frosty the Snowman, and then she sneezes. I don't know that character. She sneezes. Well, so my daughter ended up sneezing right on cue, right with it, and we were like, and I just figured, oh gosh, she's so bright, and she really
Right.
is. She's very bright. But I was like, oh, she's a genius. She needs to go ahead and go like into like a higher, um, like a preschool. So I was like, oh, so she could be a. So I ended up wanting her to be a peer buddy. She ended up becoming a peer buddy in the SNAP program, Special Needs Abilities Preschool program. They let her come in at age 2.5 because of her extensive vocabulary. So which is not something you typically think of. Usually you think of a delay, but I read to her like 17 hours every single week. So those are some of the things that I did, probably, which helped her. I used hard words. I would teach them how to generalize things. So I was teaching her peered. We were talking about edible and not edible game, and we would play that at 20 months old. So, and give her food,
Not the
edible or not.
typical, yeah, not the typical bringing up.
No, definitely not. We would walk and I would talk to her, and I would take her on trips. She would play with um peers and all of that. So I think just by doing that, I didn't realize, with her having autism, but I gave her a huge, huge head start. And I just didn't realize it. So anyway, I'm going to kind of fast forward. Age 12 is when she ended up being diagnosed. So we would say, oh, good fit teacher, not a good fit teacher. So we had to start to advocate. So I knew what kind of teacher she would need. So we would start to advocate for the type of teacher. So one of her teachers kind of alluded to the fact that we might want to take a look at like testing, which you really, you shouldn't do. But I'm thankful that she mentioned it, because you got to be so careful. So my ex-husband worked at the school. They were friends. So that's why it was brought up. So it was more like as a parent to a parent kind of thing. I don't think had it been like that, that probably would have been brought up. Anyways,
Mhm.
we went ahead and we decided to do private testing. Um, and it came back, obviously, that she was on the autism spectrum. So where do you go from there? As well as some um, auditory processing disorders.
Yeah.
So if you're not familiar with an auditory processing disorder, think of it like as a sieve, like an hourglass. So all of the sand is here, and some of the parts that you say is trickled down. So she's not going to get all of the directions. So the problem is that cognitively extremely bright could read a book in a day, all done, and everybody else was taking a lot longer. But
Right.
then they're like, "You're not reading that." So they didn't believe her that she was reading, even though she could say what it was. And then
Mhm.
she couldn't recall things. And they're like, "Wait, you're really bright, but you're just playing around. You're not being
Right.
truthful." So there was some of that. I'm gonna fast forward just a little bit. So she ended up getting a significant head injury, so severe that she hit her head on a slide, and she was playing with her guinea pigs at the time that she hit her head. So it was a major concussion. It was like a concussion like you hear of, like, for the football players. The football players get aggressive. That's what was happening. So all of a sudden she was getting suspended. So what do?
Right.
You bring in advocates. That's what we did. So we ended up, and then she ended up getting some seizures on top of, like, she had seizures first, a head injury. So all of a sudden we had all of this, things got very complicated. Contacted InSource. InSource is free. So InSource, I would highly recommend. And then we had a neuropsychologist to explain how the brain works and what happens after the head injury, the
Wow.
parts of her brain that were affected by the seizures, which happened to be her frontal lobe, which is also affected by, she also has the ADHD and then the autism and then also the auditory processing. All of those are the planning parts as well as the behavior part in her brain. So you throw that, the concussion and the frontal lobe in with the behavior side of her brain being impacted by seizures, it became pretty serious very quickly in the teenage years. Um, so we also had a behavioralist to help us sort out between everything because I at this point with the seizures, the head injury, I wasn't sure what was causing what and how to help and how to set things on a better pathway. Um, so that's what we started to do. So we were able to get her a one-on-one paraprofessional because she was getting suspended a lot. Um, and I know that's restrictive, but in order to keep her in school, I had to have that. So when I look at advocating, I look at what the child needs. If the child needs that full support, then they should have it. If they need special education services in a setting away from the classroom, that's based on their needs. Putting them in a classroom that we say, oh, least restrictive sometimes, and I know I'm not everybody will agree with me, but sometimes putting them into a general ed setting is the most restrictive because they cannot function
Yes.
in that setting.
And then my other question becomes, at what point is it too impactful on the other children in the classroom too? Because I've dealt with that too as a classroom
Mhm.
teacher. It's not fair to all of the other kids, the amount of time and effort that gets taken if the right supports aren't in place. I mean, obviously, if you've got
There
a
you
good
have
team,
it.
then
Right. So
you've got to have the strong team in place.
I agree with you. It is about this a strong team in place, and then also making sure that that child's needs are met. So if they're still having a lot of uptick in behaviors, then we need to take a look to see what other things that we need to be doing to help that child be successful in the classroom and revisiting that. Also, I also wanted to talk to you about the special education. So special education has never been fully funded. So this is the crux of the problem too. So autism is going up and up and up. I think when my daughter was diagnosed, I think it was 1 in 110. I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but I think that it might be even like 1 in the 50,
54. Last I saw,
54.
1 in
See, I
54.
knew it was getting in the 50s, so 1 in 54.
Mhm.
Um, so is it more prevalent? Is it being diagnosed more? It's a continuum. Um, but I can tell you from like a classroom standpoint, I'm seeing it more in the classroom than
For
what
sure.
I did before. Um, when I first started teaching, I don't it really wasn't, and it wasn't just because it wasn't diagnosed, but I can look back and look at my classes and the dynamics. It's definitely has changed.
For sure. I remember my very first year as a special education teacher. I was in a building where it was third through sixth grade, and it was a full inclusion program. At the time, Maryland had adopted a fully inclusive, it was called homeschool model. So students with much more severe disabilities were in gen ed settings with
Mhm.
proper supports
Uh-huh.
all day long. And I went over to the primary school to meet on an incoming second grader who was diagnosed with autism. And I remember being told by a professor in college, oh, you might see one or two cases. And that was my first case. And I think it was like the first couple of years that I taught. Within 12 years, I was an autism specialist for a
Mm,
district.
yeah.
So just in that time period, I think it's not so much that, oh, all of a sudden we have so many more people with autism or on the spectrum. I think we've learned how to diagnose better, but I think there's
Mhm.
also environmental things that are impacting because yes, that rate is going up and up and up. And I think it's being impacted even more and more so by technology, and the lack of social skills that brings to the table for
Yes.
people that already have difficulty. So,
Yeah, I would agree that I think that the problem is compounded, like you said, with the environmental, the foods that we're eating, the types of lifestyles that we're leading now, and then being so isolated. This just it's making it more challenging. Um, I was also wanted to tell you about my son. So my son ended up adopting two children that were in the foster care system. One child was next door to me in next door to my classroom, and so he was in need of a foster home. So we took the foster parenting classes, and we ended up adopting the two boys. But before we adopted them, um, the youngest was in first steps. He was let go from first steps, but he couldn't talk. So the first thing that I did is I know that in first steps you need to have two qualifications. So the two qualifications, it could be speech, it could be like fine motor, like where they couldn't put together puzzles or, do the little tinier muscle control. The other one is the physical. So um, ended up having him retested, and I sat there with the testing person and I said, I know that you need to have, and I said exactly what needed to be done. And I said, he needs to qualify. He can't
right,
talk. And if he can't talk, because he was biting, I was like, I'm not going to get bit. I never got
right.
bit. I never got bit
Oh,
because I taught him how to talk.
right,
So it's a communication end of it. So taught him how to talk. So he ended up going into the language pals or first, which was for the language to build and develop it. Then the next year he went into RTIC. So what I had noticed working with him, we were picking up the language and that kind of thing, and his personality changed just by working with him. He went from being angry a lot and to being to being happy. So his skills were lacking in the social emotional part so much that when I would run the sweeper, instead of running to force safety, he would head bang. So I
yeah,
had to teach
right,
him how to come to an adult. So when I turn it on, you're going to run to me. So I'd say, okay, I'm pretending to turn it on, the vacuum cleaner, come run to me, and he would run to me. So that's kind of where we were. We were taking care of those very,
right,
very, very basic needs. Um, and then after that, we got him into first steps, which is one way you can advocate. And so advocate when they're young. So if you notice anything, go ahead and have them looked at, because early intervention is key. And then we got him so he's part of the special needs abilities preschool program. He went on to for speech. So that's definitely do it when they're young. And
hmm,
then the second thing that I was noticing, I was like, well, I got to start working with him on some letters, just letter identification. Couldn't remember stuff. Could not remember the letter M. And so I was like, oh, okay. So I worked with them, and I was like, he was getting ready to enter into kindergarten. So I actually stopped working with him for a little bit, because I did not want him to test too high, because at that point they were doing an entrance exam. So if they tested over a certain amount, then they would go into half day. If
right,
not, then if they were lower, they would get an all day kindergarten program. I knew he needed all day kindergarten. So if I taught him too much, then I wouldn't be able to advocate for him, and he would have definitely have been behind.
right,
So I went ahead, had him early entrance the first time that he could get that tested him. And then I ended up having him, I'm talking a lot. I sort of was like, sorry,
it's
Chris.
all good. You're my guest. That's why you're here.
So, so, so then I had him tested, and he qualified. He was low. So then I started working with him over the summertime, and going into kindergarten, coming from a special ed background. I'm a huge data collector. So what I would do is we had to collect data anyways, but I collected data and I looked at which letters he knew. So every night we would work about 45 minutes on the letters and sounds. And I noticed that he was picking up about 16 letters, let's say at the very beginning. They were all different letters. And then I
Wow.
started to look at the actual letters that he knew. He knew the whole alphabet. He just didn't know it at that time. So he could only retrieve certain parts of it. Writing
Right.
his name, he probably was able to maybe like at first do maybe like 3 or 4. So a little bit lower than developmental age because his name
Right.
was really long. So what I noticed in first grade is that he would retrieve letters from his name,
Mhm.
but never the same letters. So, or parts of letters. So when I looked at all of the data, because I kept data on his name too, and I was like, he knew his name. So the teacher would say, "You need to work on his name." And mind you, he went to the same school I did. I told her no, he did not need to work on his name. He knows his name. There's
Right.
something else going on. So we had like a meeting in kindergarten, backtracking a little bit. We had a meeting in kindergarten saying something was going on. So we knew that we needed to take a closer look. That's when I started to really, really collect data. So I saved that data. I collected data over his spelling, looking at spelling errors and looking at how he was writing his name. And so I had a stack of papers. So when I went in to the meeting, I was like, so he needs to be tested, and there's something that's not right, and he's going to need an IEP to help him. So that's how I went in to the meeting and I handed
Right.
them the stack of information because I wanted to make sure that they had that data.
But you
So,
had that data, and that's the advocate that had to go in there. If you hadn't had that, who knows what would have happened? He probably wouldn't have gotten what he needed.
right. Then he also has ADHD. So imagine having a retrieval
Right.
problem and not being able to get it into your brain. So there's that part, so I've been an advocate for my children and they've needed that. So um parents advocating for their children is essential. If you're not sure how to do it, contact InSource. InSource would be the first thing that I would do. And I would
Mhm.
actually interview them because just like
Absolutely.
in any field, you have ones that are really good, some that are just mediocre. You want somebody that is a strong advocate that's going to be the best person for you, the best fit.
I couldn't agree more. And as I start to venture into this world of working as an advocate, I've worked for several years pro bono as an advocate. And one of the things I've always really prided myself on is that I do not believe that I would ever take a case or, would try to take on something that I didn't feel I could handle. I feel like, one of the parts of being a good advocate is knowing what you don't know and knowing when to say, I'm not the right person here, but let me
Right.
help you find someone else. And that's something that I really hope to, be building. If people reach out to me and I can't handle whatever they're asking for, I'll be happy to help them find someone that can. Or if it's someone that geographically needs to be closer, so be it, then I can help them in that sense. But that is something I fiercely believe that, a lot of times it's just a lack of knowledge of where to start and who to go to.
Right.
So having that opportunity to interview and check with people to make sure it's a good fit, not every advocate's going to be the best fit for you.
Right. And with you, um, yours is different. So if people can afford an advocate, then
Right.
I would definitely be contacting you.
Right.
So you know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
there's different things that people can afford at different price points and those kinds of things. But you also get what you pay for
Right.
too.
Right.
I mean, so your background, and we probably need to go into that because your background that you have, I would pay for you to advocate for my children if things were, back then. So I'm just going to turn
Right.
the
Right.
table here for just a minute. Why don't you talk about your background and how you've advocated for children?
Sure, sure. So I began my career in Montgomery County, Maryland, working in a very litigious neighborhood where I took over late in the school year. So the school was not in compliance because they didn't have a person in the position. And parents were very, very anxious and upset and worried. When I took the position, they actually held an emergency back to school night in December. And I thought, nobody's going to show up to this. This is crazy. And it was a packed cafeteria. And that's when reality hit of, okay, this is not just a teaching job. This is going to be big. And I ended up having students, that parents were diplomats for different countries, parents that were top-notch lawyers, people that were on the news and political advisors for major, federal politicians. And I worked with these parents, and all of them always had a team of advocates of some kind, whether it be a behavioralist or someone that was there for the medical components that the child might have, or a specialist in dyslexia that was working with the child, or, whatever it might be. But what I really discovered, like I said earlier, was those kids that had those advocates in meetings, a lot of times were the meetings where I felt the sharpest, because advocates really put you under fire and ask you those tough questions. And what are you going to do? And how are you going to do this? And hold you accountable. So I feel like because I jumped in so quickly to the career that I did, I learned very quickly how to navigate meetings with outside people, because that tends to not necessarily be the most comfortable setting for a lot of people. I was very fortunate that at a very young age, starting at 22, 23 years old, I was in meetings with lawyers and advocates. So it always felt natural to me. It never was something that was not normal. But I can remember about my third year into being a resource teacher, I was never with the children. I was always pulled for meetings, and I was always going to this or that. And I desperately wanted to be teaching. But the biggest thing I think happened was I was subpoenaed for court, and it was on a day that schools were closed. And I had to go to court anyway because I was subpoenaed. And I was subpoenaed to speak because I was representing the school system for the home school of the child. And it's a child I had never met, who had never come to our school, had always been in private school, whose parents were simply trying to get the district to pay for private school. So there was no intention of them ever trying to come to public schools.
Right.
But I did an evaluation and had to determine and make recommendations. And my recommendations were that our program would meet the needs of the child. I ended up on the stand for 5.5 hours that day. And
Oh,
I
wow.
remember just being so beat down and so exhausted. And I thought, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And
Mhm.
that's when I made the decision, I'm going to go back and get my master's degree. And I enrolled at Johns Hopkins and became a classroom teacher. And I always said to people, I didn't leave special education. I just became a teacher.
Okay.
I still always had all of those students with IEPs, and I always was the inclusion teacher, and I always was teaching the different small groups and different things like that, and teaching, teachers on differentiation and how to do interventions and different
Yeah.
things like that, even beyond being a classroom teacher. And of course, after a while, I got sick and tired of that end of the world and thought maybe special ed is where I need to be. And, things fell into place, and a former principal of mine did some recruiting and got me to come down to a district in South Carolina with him, where I worked as an autism specialist and behavior interventionist. But then I also worked as a district compliance officer, and I oversaw Section 504 plans and making sure that we were in compliance across the district for students that had plans, but also identifying students that may not have been identified because we were under identifying at the time in the state. So I helped to try and really teach the staff in the schools why 504 plans were so crucial for students that had medical problems or medical disabilities going on. But it also overlapped a lot with the special education department and did a lot of sitting in on compliance cases for special education as well. In fact, I was always the note taker because I took copious notes. So I'd get,
See that?
get into that 5-hour IEP meeting, and I'd be the one to take the notes. And I'm like, why did I sign up for that? But it always kept me on task and focused too, which was a good thing. Anyway,
So
long story short, after several more years, went back into the classroom for a little while and then became a behavior interventionist. COVID hit and life changes. I decided, you know what? I don't feel like I'm going to be able to make a difference from my small school, my small district, and my small little, spot in the world. I want to have more of a global impact in helping students. And so I made the decision to leave public education and start my own business, but also I'm working as a national professional development specialist and coach for teachers. And two main projects I'm working on right now, I'm very excited about. One is partnering with parents to help caregivers understand how to support students in the home setting, but also working with a group of teachers virtually in Philadelphia on how to understand special education and 504 and IDEA in terms of supporting kids with special education needs. So I feel like I've gotten to kind of hand cherry pick all of the things I loved about what I was doing. The only thing missing is that daily interaction with the kids. I do miss that. So I look forward to talking to you to get the stories from the things the kids
yes.
say, because that is something I
Yeah,
do.
that is fun. So I do have a couple of questions for you. I know the answers to these, but I don't know if everybody does in the audience. So a couple of questions that I have for clarification. What is a 504 plan and what is IDEA?
Absolutely. So I'll start with IDEA because that's the bigger one of the two. That is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it encompasses all of the laws that help protect students with disabilities. Anything from any of the 13 disability categories would be covered under that. Section 504 is part of the Rehabilitation Act, and that covers students who are not diagnosed with a disability that impacts their education from the standpoint of their learning, but necessarily it's a medical impact. So, for example, if I have type 1 diabetes, I might need a 504 plan because on days that I'm having problems with regulating my insulin, I might not be able to attend my classes or pay as much of attention in those classes as I may have. So having accommodations in place for a student like that may need some extra things just to help bring them, back up to what we consider to be whatever, the average student is receiving, so that but they're not benefiting from this plan, but we're equaling that playing ground for everybody.
So, and then I was listening to you talk because I can see one of the benefits of hiring somebody to be an advocate is that when you call, like for in-source, let's say you have to ask for like the same person and you have to ask for them.
Right.
So the other thing is it's voluntary. Voluntary is very different than a paid person. So with a paid
Right.
person, you're going to get the same person. You're going to be getting the note taking that you're going to be doing. You're also going to be contacting like their providers once you get a consent, because you'd have to obviously get a consent. But once you got the consent, you could actually talk to the behavioralist or neuropsychologist. So you could do some team meetings. So you could make sure that when you go into a meeting, that you would be able to have all of your bases covered. Um,
Absolutely.
and there's something to be said. I'm going to tell you, because as a parent, and it is very intimidating. And I have an education background, but I'm going to tell you, it's intimidating to go into it because, first of all, I know that they don't have all of the resources that they need. I know that
Right.
they're going to try to say we don't have the funds, funds for
Right.
it, because they don't,
Right.
because it hasn't been fully funded. So, so again, it goes back to money, unfortunately, but it does do that. But when you have a team and your numbers on your side might outweigh the other side, you have a different feel. When you go into an IEP meeting by yourself, can be very
Oh,
intimidating as a
extremely.
parent. And I
Yes.
and I have a special ed background, so we did ours reversed. I had a general ed one, then I went and received my master's in special ed. So,
It's so fascinating to me too, because I sat in so many meetings over the years as a school employee, and I watched district employees jump through hoops because there were lawyers and advocates in the room. And I understood the reasoning, but it frustrated me to no end, because there would be a child with the same needs that we would meet on a week later. And I would take, the same proposal to the director and say, I think this child needs XYZ. And I would be told, well, that's not in our budget. Well, but that child needs it. And just because they don't have someone fighting for it doesn't mean we shouldn't be giving it to them.
correct.
That was a turning point for me in my career of, maybe I need to figure out how to get out and help more kids get what they need. This is bigger than, and I know it's bigger than school systems. I know even at the district level, they are only given what they're given, and they're given so much, not enough in the sense of funding for staff, materials, materials for, technology modifications, all those different kinds of things that we could be giving to students for adaptive equipment and alternative seating, and things that we know from research based studies help our students, but yet we're not funding the schools to have those things.
No, and the other thing is, since you've been out for a little bit, at least in our school district, there's open positions.
Oh,
We
yes.
can't find people to work with students and to be able to be a paraprofessional. So they might need it. We might say, yeah, we need it. Where do you find them?
Right.
And that's the other part that you run into too, is the staffing issues.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I can address that from the standpoint of the last year I was in public education. One of the reasons I decided to leave was I was supposed to be a support staff for kids with behavioral disabilities that needed ongoing, consistent intervention. But I was constantly being pulled to cover the front desk, or cover lunch and recess duty for an administrator, or cover a science class for a teacher that was out. And it became so frustrating to me because I wasn't able to do what I needed to do. The irony in that is the school system has now cut all of those positions because they need teachers. So they forced those positions that people had back into the classrooms. It was go to the classroom or leave. And, unfortunately, a lot of people said, well, I'm leaving then. And that's a nationwide problem. Everybody says we have a teacher shortage. I always like to say, well, we really have a teacher recruitment and retention problem.
Yes, we do.
If we have a lot of teachers, we just don't have them working in schools. We have tons of teachers that are leaving in droves education completely. You and I, at least, we know when our career with public education is done, we wanted to stay in education no matter what. There are people that are just pivoting completely, exit stage left. I'm going to go into sales and I'm going to work for a computer company, and who knows? Yeah. And it's sad to me because our kids are going to suffer. The future is going to suffer.
And we talked about that because it's one of the reasons why I wanted to still stay in, because I'm getting closer to retirement. And I started to think about, I'm like, if everybody's leaving in droves, like you said, we have a retention problem. People are getting jobs elsewhere. We're going to have beginning year teachers without anybody to mentor them. They won't know the tips and tricks from like an older teacher, or somebody that's mid 15 years, let's say, up like into 30, because you learned things as you go, and they're not going to have that. They're going to be floundering.
Right.
And then we talk about problems. We're going to have serious problems. So that's a lot of the reasons why I'm trying to get out these these books as much as I can too. So
right. And I think that there's so much power to come with the class that we're going to be offering for parents that will help. I'm hoping help parents feel that empowerment to be able to speak up and really feel like they can advocate for their kids. I think a lot of times it's, what if I don't do it correctly? Well, that's why people like us are here, to help support people. But
Yes.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know we've gone way over our time limit. So I appreciate you giving up this time because I know you've got to get up early tomorrow and teach those babies and they
Yes.
need you. So I do appreciate it. And I just wanted to say thank you again for coming on. And I'm sure this is not the only time you will be on. So
Thank you. It was
we'll
a
have
lot of
many more conversations about advocating and how to support kids.
thank you.
Thank you. Let me go
Thank
ahead and just say goodbye to the audience and have a great
you.
night.